We're working our way through the book of Ecclesiastes, and we continue to do so today. I'll take you to chapter 4, where we left off last Sunday, after Solomon is lamenting the fact that there are oppressors and that there are the oppressed who have no power and they are not comforted. And seeing that, he drew a conclusion that it would be better to be already dead or yet never to have been yet than to see what he saw, which of course is a very dismal conclusion, but is a reasonable one if you extract the hope of the afterlife and fellowship with God from the equation, and you just look at things from a standpoint of this world and life under the sun with no reference beyond it. But at any rate, we're going to go now to verse 4. And from verse 4 through to the end of the chapter, he's going to deal primarily with three things. The first thing he's going to talk about are three evils that pertain to work, to your job. And then he's going to do, after that, he's going to talk about the fact that there is advantage in unity and in companionship. And then lastly, he's going to talk about how fickle public opinion is with respect to political leaders. So those are going to be the things that we look at in this chapter if we get that far. So let's start at verse 4. Again, I considered all travail and every right work, that for this a man is envied of his neighbor. This is also vanity and vexation of the spirit. The fool foldeth his hands together and eateth his own flesh. Better is an handful with quietness than both the hands full with travail and vexation of spirit. Then I returned, and I saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone, and there is not a second. Yea, he hath neither child nor brother, yet there is not child nor brother, yet is there no end of all his labor. Neither is his eye satisfied with riches, neither saith he, for whom do I labor and bereave my soul of good? This is also vanity, yea, it is a sore travail. The three evils that pertain to work. The first one is that when you work well at good work, right work, then there's the possibility that you're going to be envied of your neighbor. And you don't need to look far to discover this. You young people, you'll find this out yourself if you go to school. You'll find the student in school that is the most diligent and most accomplished will often be envied by those who are not. Or if you particularly outshine others in sports, you'll find that out. Or when you start working. My grandson, Nick, is a very diligent worker. And he used to work at Subway, and the other kids resented him and would kind of single him out and set him aside because he would work while they wanted to play on their telephones. And so you're going to find that. If you are a hard worker and a good worker, you're going to be envied for that. I experienced that as a young preacher. And I would remember being envied by older ministers, even the man that baptized me. He and another older man were members of our church, and they got jealous of me because the people wanted to hear me instead of hearing them. I remember when I just started preaching, I'd been preaching for very long. I don't even think I was ordained. I went to an association in South Alabama, in Atmore, Alabama. It was the Antioch Association. And they put me up twice to preach. The people were so excited about a young man that could preach. And I remember an old preacher coming up to me at lunchtime and said, "Brother Mott, the Ranging Committee done you wrong." Meaning they shouldn't have put you up twice. They should have only put you up once. But that was just simply jealousy over the fact that I was getting attention that he wasn't, because I can guarantee you the people would have rather have heard me than have heard him. And if you ever heard him preach, you would have understood why. They would rather have heard me than hear him. So you're going to, if you do well at good work, somewhere down the line you're going to encounter envy. And this is a vanity and vexation of the spirit. It simply shouldn't be, but it is. It's one of the frustrations that we encounter in this world, that you're going to be envied just because you try to do the best that you can. And when it comes to envy, you can't win with an envious person. They just have it in for you, and they're going to find something about you not likable. They'll do a diligent search, and because it really isn't about you, it's about themselves and their own insecurity. And somebody said you can never maintain clean hands by throwing mud at others. But that's what some people do. They try to put other people down, and the reason they're doing it is to try to make themselves feel better, try to assume some moral high ground so they don't feel so outdone. And that's what we read here. We noticed this last Wednesday night in our Bible study in Proverbs 27:4. Wrath is cruel and anger is outrageous, but who is able to stand before envy? And even our blessed Lord was delivered up to be crucified because of envy. You read that in Mark 15:10, and even Pontius Pilate could recognize that he knew that the chief priests had delivered him up for envy. And that's in Mark 15:10. You see, he experienced, what I was talking about, having experienced myself, when there were people that simply would rather hear me preach than hear others, and these other preachers got jealous. In Luke 19:47 and 48, we read of our Lord, that he taught daily in the temple, but the chief priests, the ones that delivered him up for envy, and the scribes and the chief of the people sought to destroy him and could not find what they might do. And here's why. For all the people were very attentive to hear him. They wanted to hear him preach. And they got jealous of that and the attention that he was garnering. Commenting on this fact, and this is quite interesting and searching, soul-searching, Derek Kidner, in his commentary that I will refer to from time to time, thought it was excellent if you can weed out the new versions that he uses and correcting a King James Bible, but if you can weed that out, he has some great insights in the book of Ecclesiastes, and he said this: the fact remains that all too much of our hard work and high endeavor is mixed with the craving to outshine and not to be outshone. Even in friendly rivalry, such as we have between teams, in sporting events, like the rivalry in this church that we have where some of us say go blue, even though blue went, pitifully. Those of us that are U of M fans versus those of you, I won't say us, I don't even want to be identified with it, that are Buckeye fans, and so we have this friendly rivalry going on. But we've got to be careful there, because, when you identify with a team, that becomes a part of you, a part of your identity. You got to be careful about that. So he says, even in friendly rivalry, this may play a larger part than we think. Have you ever played a board game with someone that was a sore loser? Yeah, You know what that is that motivates that? That's envy. I don't want to be outdone. I don't want to be the loser in this case. I've had to chide my grandchildren at times about that. It's just a game. Come on. But even in friendly rivalry, this may play a larger part than we think. For we can bear to be outclassed for some of the time by some of the people, but not too regularly and not too profoundly. We don't like to be outdone. And just face it. The Bible says the spirit that dwelleth in us lusteth to envy. And I think to some degree, to some extent, every one of us has a problem with that we really have to keep a check on. We just don't like to be outdone. And so that's one vanity, one evil that he mentions with relation to work, and that is if you do a good job, you're going to be envied of your neighbor. And then the next evil is the guy that just decides to just forego labor altogether and just sit on his haunches and do nothing and draw a welfare check. It says, the fool foldeth his hands together. Now, to understand what that's talking about, you need to compare that with Proverbs 6, what this folding the hands together is all about. And this scripture will explain it. This is the lazy man in Proverbs chapter 6. And we're going to read verses 6 through 11. Go to the ant, thou sluggard. Consider a ways and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer, and gathereth her food in the harvest. How long wilt thou sleep, O sluggard? When wilt thou arise out of thy sleep? Yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So we're talking here about a lazy man that won't get himself up out of bed just sleeps. And he says, a guy like that, he says, so shall thy poverty come as one that traveleth. And a traveling man is going to come. Why? Because he's traveling to get there. And thy want as an armed man. It's going to come, your want and poverty is going to come on you like an assault from an army if you're lazy. So that's this guy here. He folds his hands. That's the fool. The fool foldeth his hands rather than unfolding them, getting up and doing some work with his hands. He foldeth his hands together like that, like he's sleeping, and eateth his own flesh. You know, if you don't work, the Bible has a judgment. It says, he that will not work should not eat. That's in 2 Thessalonians 3:10. God ordained, and it's found in Genesis 3:19, that we eat bread by the sweat of our brow, sweat of our face. Work. That's how we're supposed to eat, by working for it. And again, if a man will not work, neither should he eat. 2 Thessalonians 3:10. And were that rule enforced like it ought to be, that means this man that doesn't work doesn't get food. And if he doesn't get food, what happens? His body starts to devour itself. You know, eateth his own flesh. And this is letting us know in this passage that laziness is a means to self-destruction. And it really is. And one of the sad things about living in a society that is more of a welfare state is giving money to people that don't work. In fact, that was one of the problems here with the lockdown, is that people were finding that they could get more money in unemployment that they could by going out to work. So where's the incentive to go work? But a culture that subsidizes that kind of mindset is subsidizing really a self-destructive mindset. It is self-destructive to be lazy. But that's the second evil we encounter in the realm of work, is the fool, the sluggard that just refuses to work and engages in what is a very self-destructive behavior. It's emotionally, intellectually self-destructive as well as physically self-destructive. Then the third evil that we find mentioned here is the evil of greed, and the man that labors only for himself and what he can accumulate, with no thought of anybody else benefiting from it. Like he said in verse 8, there is one alone, and there is not a second. Yea, he hath neither child nor brother, yet there is no end of all of his labor. He's got nobody to share it with, nobody to leave it to, but he just work. Neither is his eye satisfied with riches. He never has enough. And then he's so busy accumulating, that he never stops to ask this question, for whom do I labor? That's a real good question. Ask yourself, what makes me get up every day and go working for it? Go to work. For whom do I labor? Of course, most of you have an answer to that question. For whom do I labor and bereave my soul of good? I mean, this guy doesn't even really give himself a chance to enjoy his money. It's just work, accumulate. And he said, this is also vanity. It's an empty life. That's what vanity is. It's emptiness. Yea, it is a sore travail. Just acquiring stuff for the sake of stuff is indeed vanity. It is a sore evil. And you see, as Christians, we're to work with a different objective. Sure, to provide for ourselves so that we can eat. He that will not work shall not eat. But we're supposed to work with an objective to have, to give to him that needeth, rather than just to have for ourselves. Let me give you two verses. In Ephesians 4:28, this is the way to circumvent this third evil of greed and just working for oneself, for what one can attain for oneself. In Ephesians 4:28, we read, let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands the thing which is good, that he may give to him that needeth. You think of most any job that any man does, he's using his hands. Even in mine, pulling down books, turning pages, writing and composing outlines. Even though I'm using my mind, what I'm doing with my mind gets transferred out into my hands. So that's a pretty apt description. Working with his hands, the thing which is good. And I think it's interesting that he qualifies working the thing which is good. Because you know, not all work is good. Being a hooker may be work, but it's not good work. Being a drug dealer may be work, but it's not good work. And on down the line we could go, but I think those are vivid examples enough. Working is with his hands a thing which is good. Notice the objective, that he may have to give to him that needeth. Not just to have for himself, but to be able to share with someone else that is in need. That is a very worthy objective. And I would like to say this to the honor of Don Dirkseide, that one of the objectives that he had in mind in the money that he accumulated was that when he was gone, he wanted that money to be available to people in the church that would need it. That can be said to his honor, to give to him that needeth. And then in Acts 20, 34 through 35, we have the example of the Apostle Paul, who preached along with working. In Acts chapter 20, 34 and 35. Yea, yourselves know that these hands have ministered unto my necessities and to them that were with me. Not just for myself. He didn't just labor for himself. And I've showed you all things, how that so laboring you ought to support the weak, and to remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how he said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. And so, that's the third evil. 3 evils. The first evil, being envied for doing a good job. The second evil, not doing a job at all. The third evil, working only for yourself because of this insatiable greed to accumulate more and more and never being satisfied with what you have. But now over against these 3 evils included in this section is some very sage advice, good advice. And it's also advice we encounter in the book of Proverbs, which is written from a very different perspective than the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes is being written, as we say, from the perspective of under the sun, trying to figure out what's the best way to live in this world with no consideration of what's beyond the sun and in the next life or anything like that. Just looking at it within the box of one's brief span of life in this world under the sun. How's the best way to live a life like that? And it has a different perspective, like we say, from the book of Proverbs, both of which were written by Solomon. But in Ecclesiastes, again, it's an experiment that he's doing to try to find out what is the best life, again, without any consideration of a final judgment and an eternal reward or anything like that. But then comes this little piece of advice over against all of this evil, that vanity he's dealing with. Better is an handful with quietness than both hands full with travail and vexation of spirit. Now, the same advice that it's better to have less and have quietness than to have more and just have a bunch of vexation and distress and travail, just worry and grief and pain. It's better to have less than have both hands full with all of that. And again, let's see this same advice in Proverbs. In Proverbs 15 and verse 17, better is a dinner of herbs, which would be like a vegetarian diet. Better is a dinner of herbs where love is than a stalled ox and hatred therewith. And obviously a stalled ox is a much fatter, more filling food than just lettuce. I had a scow one time. It was a trainer. I honestly, in hindsight, think she probably had an eating disorder. I mean, we invited her and her fiancé over to our house for dinner, and Linda fixed this beautiful dinner. She would take only the tiniest portions. She just had this thing about not eating. And she was going to go to Florida for her honeymoon. She asked her mother, she said, well, where are some good places to eat? And considering how little she ate, her mother said, I don't know why she's asking that question. You can buy a head of lettuce anywhere. That's about the sum total of her diet. Head of lettuce anywhere. So anyway, but where love is, even if it's dinner of herbs, that's better than a stalled ox with hatred. And then in Proverbs 17:1, better is a dry morsel and quietness therewith than an house full of sacrifices, which would mean you'd have a bunch of different beasts with strife. So here's this advice of it's better to have a quiet life than have all these possessions with travail and vexation and hatred and all of those things going with it, and strife. You see, and it is a fact that this is a better way to live under the sun, even though it does not attain the ultimate good. It doesn't attain the ultimate good. But if you're just considering life under the sun and what's the best way to live, this is by far a better way to live. To live a life without hatred, without strife, and with all this travail and vexation. And this is an interesting thing in this section. And I noticed this morning I overlooked something. Because the point I'm about to make is this is the first of three things listed in this chapter that are described as better. Notice better is in handful with quietness. But I overlooked the fact that if I just backed up a few verses, in verse 3, he also talked about something better. And that is that it's better never to have been born yet than to live and see this oppression of the poor. They have no comforter when they're being so oppressed. And all they can do is cry. And rather than see that, it's better not to have been born yet. But we saw that that really was a very dismal conclusion and really not a good conclusion, because it doesn't factor in the comfort that is available from God for those who do suffer oppression in this world. It's just basically an escapist outlook, so I didn't include that in the three things that are better. But now this one here, for sure and shooting, is better. That's excellent advice. It's better to have less and have peace than to have more and not have peace. This is an example of something that Solomon told us in chapter 2, and that is that wisdom excelleth folly, as far as light excelleth the darkness. This is a piece of that wisdom that excels folly. And it does help, if you have this kind of mindset, it does help to better chart your course in this world of vanity. If you live by this maxim, you will have more love, more peace, less strife, less vexation. If you can understand that it's better to have less with that than to have more with all that other garbage. Matthew Henry, commenting on this, said, "Moderate pains and moderate gains will do best." You hear that? Moderate pains and moderate gains will do best. And this couples well with the advice that was given by the beloved Apostle Paul to Christians. It's better to have less with quietness. That's an objective we should all have before us in our life, is how can I calm my life down so I'm not in such an feverish uproar all the time, vexed and frustrated and all the strife and so forth that can go with that. The Apostle Paul, writing in 1 Thessalonians 4:11 and 12, 1 Thessalonians 4:11 and 12. I mean, we live in a very affluent society, do we not? I mean, we are the envy of the world. People want to come here because they see the opportunity to have a better life, and by that they mean a life with more comforts and more possessions. And yet, what is one of the number one problems in our culture, generating all kinds of mental, psychological, and physical problems? It is the problem of stress. With all of this affluence comes all this stress and this feverish running. And this is the better life? Solomon is telling us no. Hey, stress. How many problems are caused? Have you ever been to the doctor and they tell you your problem is stress? And so Paul gives us this advice in 1 Thessalonians 4:11 that you study to be quiet. And you know, he says study to be quiet. This is something you got to work at. It's something we need to learn, because we have this feverish energy of the flesh beset with wanting more. That you study to be quiet and to do your own business and to work with your own hands as we commanded you, that you may walk honestly toward them that are without, and that you may have lack of nothing. So he's commanding them to work, but he's telling them to make sure that you couple that with quietness. You don't want to end up like this guy we just read about in Ecclesiastes, where he's laboring, and his eye is never satisfied. Doesn't even give himself time to really enjoy the fruits of his labor. And then we are taught to pray this, and I do this all the time. in 1 Timothy chapter 2, when I'm praying for our government leaders, and I do, I pray this, that God will so order them in their policies, or restrain them in their policies, in verse 2, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. That I can just go and do an honest day's work for an honest day's pay, that I can just serve the Lord, go to church, and just live my life in peace and quietness. We're taught to pray for that. And so, obviously, this accords well with the advice that we're reading here, better is an handful with quietness than both hands full with travail and vexation of the Spirit. And so a good lesson here is that if you would avoid envy, don't try to upstage. Learn to be content with less, do less. You may avoid some envy. And don't be driven by greed. Find the quietness that comes with contentment. However, the interesting thing is this advice is great advice, and you don't even have to be religious to think this is good advice. You see, remember, we're looking at life under the sun. And even if you're just trying to find out what's the best way to live in this world, with no reference to pleasing God, with no reference to keeping His commandments, with no reference to standing before Him at the end to be judged and rewarded, if you just exclude all of that, and you're just looking at what's the best way to get through this world, that advice of better is little with, better is a handful with quietness, is still the better way to go, even for somebody of this world. And this brings me to something very interesting. You will find secular psychologists who will give that same exact advice that Solomon just gave. I have an interesting book that Susan Bosky, a former member of our church, recommended to me a number of years ago, called The Circle of Simplicity. Subtitle, Return to the Good Life. And isn't that what Solomon is trying to teach us about, the good life? And the good life is a life that's not just all about get. In other words, quiet down, calm down, be satisfied with less, and enjoy what you have. Because if you're just consumed with more, you're not giving yourself space to enjoy what you have. And so, just commenting on the book to show you how her advice accords with Solomon's, for a growing number of people, simplicity has been a path to experience the joy of life, to cherish its richness and vitality. It strips away the burdens of our daily lives so that we are left with exhilaration, spirit, and fullness. These people are finding that less work, less rushing, less debt is more. More time with family and friends. More time with community. More time with nature. More time to develop a meaningful and compelling spirituality, whatever that is. And when you read her book, it's definitely not zeroing in on New Testament Christianity. I mean, this book would work for a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Muslim or a whatever. I mean, it's not being written from a biblical standpoint. But it's interesting, it's giving the same advice Solomon gave. So, as I say, there are secular counselors and psychologists that would recommend this advice of Solomon as a better way to live in this world with no reference to the world to come. It just makes good sense to live that way. In some ways, less is better in this case, and more. We're done with that section. Let's go to the second one now. And that is the advantage of companionship. Now, before we get into that, look how this is going to be set in juxtaposition to verse 8, where he talks about the man that has neither child nor brother, and there's no end of his labor, and he's never satisfied, and he never asks himself, for whom do I labor? This is the selfish man that it's just all for himself to accumulate more and more and more. The proverbial Scrooge, Ebenezer Scrooge, you remember that story? Well, he's talked about in Ecclesiastes. And so now in verses 9 through 12, let me read them. Yea, two are better than one. Now we're into a second thing that's better. We just studied that better's an handful with quietness. Now we're going to look at the fact that companionship is better than loneliness. Two are better than one. because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him that is alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him up. And again, if two lie together, they can have heat. But how can one be warm alone? And if one prevail against him, two shall withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So Solomon sets forth the advantages of companionship, and of course you might guess, I am going to make most special application of that to church companionship and church fellowship. How important that is. Companionship is obviously better than loneliness. And that is set over against the sore travail of the man that hath neither child nor brother for whom he labors. And again, as we're going to see, this particular advice isn't just limited to religious people or people in church, though I'm going to make special application that way. Even secularists have come to realize that companionship is better than loneliness. I mean, wasn't it Barbra Streisand that used to sing and captured essentially what is being taught here? People who need people are the luckiest people in the world. And I don't think I did as well as she. Yeah? Pardon? Yeah, Caroline sings it. She went through a Barbra Streisand phase. And I was so happy because before that it was Reba McEntire. Oh, man. Woo. She even wore her hair like Reba. She thought it was so glamorous. We've got a picture of her, one of her school pictures. But look, it's hideous. She had these blue glasses and she hadn't got her braces yet, so she had these fangs and the Reba look. It was frightening. So I was glad when she graduated to Barbra Streisand. Barbra Streisand was an accomplished vocalist, flaming left-wing liberal, but you've got to give credit where credit is due. She was an accomplished vocalist. I loved her singing. Still do. But she sang that song, People Who Need People Are the Happiest or Luckiest People in the World, and that captures exactly what Solomon is talking about, showing you that this is just plain, sensible, good advice for anybody in the world, whether they're a Christian or not. But again, we're going to make special application to our church fellowship. So God saw in the very beginning, if you look at Genesis 2:8, that it is not good that man should be alone. And Solomon is expanding on that. It is just companionship is better than loneliness. And there are advantages to companionship, and he lists three of them, or he starts to list them. First of all, they have a good reward for their labor. You see, more people working on a particular project can gain more, so they have a good reward for their labor because it's a combined effort that accomplishes more and therefore profits are more. But it's also just plain rewarding to work together with others. It just is. You know, when the team works together and the team achieves the objective, they can all go out and celebrate what they've accomplished together. That's part of the good reward for their labor, is the celebration afterwards. Some of you are nodding your head yes, because you've experienced this in the workplace. It's just the benefit of team effort. It's very advantageous. You can just... I know, for example, last evening I had a most delightful evening. I went over and had supper with the Scholes, spent some time with them, and then went over to one of our fellow that coordinates our German meetup. He invited a few of us over to his house, and we watched Masters and Commanders with Russell Crowe in German. Oh, was that exciting. We had lovely conversation together, and it's really good for me because, I mean, I read German, but I'm finding that to really improve my skills, I need that interchange of conversation. I need to talk to other people. I need to hear it and then draw on my vocabulary to express myself, and things come back. I remember things and that I had forgotten, and it's just for me personally, you know, you guys have your things that you do with other people that are a lot of fun. Well, that's my thing that I do that for me is a lot of fun. And so we all have a good reward for our labor doing this together, because these are other guys that are interested in the language, and there wasn't a native German there. There were just all guys like myself that have learned it and are fascinated by it and love it, and we just enjoy being together and doing this together. It stimulates and helps us all to learn even better. And then the second advantage is not only is there a good reward for their labor, and again, I mean, I go home, I'm still thinking in German, I'm looking up words, I go to bed, I'm thinking in German, I get up this morning, I'm thinking more things in German, I even said some prayer this morning in German, it just got me in the German mode, and I like that. Das gefällt mir sehr, means I like that a lot. See? So there's the good reward for the labor. And then the second thing is companions help each other when they're down. If they fall, the one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him that's alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him up. So that's an advantage of companionship, is propping each other up, helping each other when you're down. Isn't that what we try to do here? Isn't that what we're supposed to try to do here, is help each other up when we're down? And then there's warmth to be derived from companionship. Again, I'm going to make application of that to our Christian experience. As he says in verse 11, if two lie together, then they have heat. But how can one be warm alone? You know, Scripture speaks of those. This is a verse in Matthew 24:12 that are those whose love will wax cold. And if we were ever living in a time when that could happen, we're living in it now. In Matthew 24:12, because iniquity shall abound, and if it's not abounding now, I don't want to be around when it starts. I mean, it is abounding. So many moral restraints have just been thrown aside in society. Iniquity shall abound. The media is full of it. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. We've got to really watch out for that. And that word cold here, when it's referring to something like love, means void of ardor, warmth, or intensity of feeling. Lacking enthusiasm, heartiness, or zeal, indifferent, apathetic. It can refer to persons, their affections, and actions. So the thing we've got to watch about in a culture like ours is our love for Jesus, our love for His Word, our love for His house, our love for His service, beginning to lack intensity of feeling and enthusiasm. Just start going through the motions, but not really into it. You know, when you come to church and you're involved in this activity with the others, it ought to kindle a fire in every one of us. We ought to go out here fueled up and fired up for another week. That's the whole idea here. Deriving warmth from the mutual fellowship and companionship. And then turn to Revelation and see how exceedingly God is displeased when there is lacking that warmth in our service. In Revelation 3:14 through 16. And unto the angel of the church of the Laodiceans write, these things saith the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation of God. I know thy works, that thou art neither cold nor hot. I would thou wert cold or hot. So then, because thou art lukewarm, and neither cold nor hot, I will spew thee out of my mouth, which is just another way of saying, I will vomit you out, because you make me sick. That's essentially what he's telling this church. Here's a church that makes Jesus sick. God forbid our church ever be a church that makes Jesus sick. Because let me tell you, if he spews us out, we're not going to be a church anymore. We might be a gathering, but we won't be his church. Not every group that gets together is the church of the Lord Jesus. We don't want to be that. And so if we want to avoid that, we want to avoid this horrible condition of lukewarmness. And lukewarm, when referring to persons and their actions or attributes, means having little warmth or depth of feeling, lacking zeal, enthusiasm, or ardor, indifferent. Much the same as the definition of cold. It's just when we just start going through the motions and we just don't have much warmth or depth of feeling to what we're going through. You see, in church, of prime importance is understanding. understanding what we're doing, learning. It's not just an emotional experience. That's what you see a lot of in churches nowadays, where people go to church and they get all hooped up. The music is lively and they're clapping their hands and making all kinds of motions, and it's just this huge emotional experience. But you really don't learn much of anything. No, Jesus said, learn of me, and you shall find rest to your souls. We're supposed to praise God with the Spirit and with understanding. My job is to feed you with knowledge and understanding. So the most important thing is that you know what you're doing, that you understand what you're doing, that you know this is the truth. You understand it. You believe it. Faith fed by knowledge and understanding is important. However, that does not exclude the emotional dimension. I mean, if it's just all knowledge and facts and information, and we don't feel a warmth and a love and a kindling within ourselves by that, there is something very wrong. There is definitely an emotional dimension to the experience of our holy religion, remembering that one of the ninefold fruit of the Spirit is joy, which is an emotion. And so this is what was lacking. They were going through the motions, but they lacked the ardor. And so he told them in verse 19, be zealous, therefore, get on fire and repent. And so one of the things that actually is designed to fire us up, if you will, is our fellowship. Being together with other believers, igniting a fire under each other, encouraging each other in our faith, sharing our burdens, praying for one another, and encouraging each other to hold fast the faith and not give up. And that's what our fellowship should do. It should kindle our zeal for the cause of Christ. Charles Bridges said, and rightly so, a live coal left alone soon loses its vital heat. Take one coal from the fire and put it over here by itself, and it'll lose its heat. It'll turn cold. But heat the coals around it, and we have a genial atmosphere. The most lively professor, meaning today, the most lively, ardent, active believer, they call them professors because they professed their faith. The most lively professor left alone is in danger of waxing cold in selfishness. But the precious communion of the saints warms the Christian from the very center. So you take any one of us and stick us over here by ourselves with no contact, nothing, no dealing with anybody else in the church. You're going to get cold. You're just going to get cold. And that's why even to you non-resident members, it's very important that you maintain some form of communication and contact, and do not think you are exempt from this experience. Two are better than one, the wise man said. Take his word for it. And we need that fellowship together to keep from growing indifferent and cold so that we just go through the motions. Very, very important part of our holy religion. And then the next advantage, we're looking at the advantages. We have a good reward for our labor. It's beneficial for us all as we work together. We all derive benefit from it. We're companions. We help each other when we're down. I help you when you're down. You help me when I am down. You do. Sometimes somebody will call me on the phone and they will say, Pearl used to do this. She will say, I thought you could use some good news. Oh boy, can I ever. And so she tells me something good and helps to make my day. Helps to keep me going, lifting me up. And I appreciate that very much. Very much. And so there is the helping each other when we're down. There's the warmth, the kindling of our zeal, our fire that we derive from companionship, or should. And there is the strength. And let me stop and say this. A good point of self-examination for all of us is ask yourself, what do I do to lift somebody else up? Do I ever do anything to give somebody else a lift? Or am I always just dragging somebody down? I don't want to put anybody on a guilt trip, because from time to time they share their burdens and their sorrows with their brethren, reaching out to get some encouragement and get some strength, some uplifting. But don't be just that. Don't just be somebody that's a downer. Look for ways that you can build somebody else up. Go to somebody else that is down to give them that encouraging word. And you know what I have found? If you're down and you reach outside your, I'll invent a word here, downness, to reach out to somebody else that's down, to lift them up, you're going to feel better. It's going to turn right around and lift you up. I always remember my aunt, my dear Aunt Gladys, my grandfather's youngest sister. I've said if my dear Aunt Gladys isn't in heaven, I don't think any of us are going to make it. That was the kind of woman that she was. She had cancer. And it was a terminal cancer. And I phoned her to reach out to her, to be a comfort to her. And she was so upbeat and positive, she turned around and comforted me. You see? And that's what enabled her to bear what she had the better. So again, I'm not criticizing anybody for reaching out when they're down. God knows I've done my share of it. That's one of the advantages of having pastor friends, guys that understand what I go through because they occupy the same job. And so we share our mutual burdens. And it's a great help to talk to somebody that really can relate to what I'm experiencing, and lifting each other up and encouraging each other in that way. So again, this is one of the very important parts of our church life, is our fellowship, to kindle our zeal for the cause of Christ. And this is why I believe that the devil has a major hand in the lockdowns because of the coronavirus. Locking that border and depriving our brethren from being able to come here. Thank God, however, when means are wanting, God does often give extra grace to keep us going when the ordinary means whereby we draw those that fire, if you will, are wanting. And some of them will get together with each other on a smaller scale, and I think that's wonderful for them to do that, to be an encouragement to one another to the degree that they can. People need people. I mean, this, holding distance from people. When Mary Dale lost Conrad, I've asked her this. The funeral home was very gracious and did not hold us, weren't in there chiding us because we didn't all have our faces covered standing 6 feet apart. And people were going around at the final viewing and giving Mary Dale hugs. And I've said, Mary Dale, what would it have been like if everybody that walked by you stood 6 feet away and said, sorry for your loss, through a mask? What would that have been? It would have made one of the most horrific, the most horrific, grievous loss of her life all the more insupportable. If ever there was a time that somebody needed a hug and somebody close, it was then. And she survived. We all survived. Praise be to God. I mean, I can understand precautions because you don't want to spread a virus. I mean, I get that. But, sometimes there are things in this world that we go through that there's no way you're going to get through it without some kind of damage, some way, somehow. It's just life. You're not going to escape that totally. You understand? And I look at not only the problems of the spread of the virus and the ills that have come from that, but I also think we have to consider the other ills that have come by the measures taken to prevent that. And they have been great also. Very great indeed. Very great indeed. We need this companionship. I mean, if two lie together, they have heat, but not if they're 6 feet apart. No. Greet the brethren with a kiss of charity, the holy kiss. You don't do that 6 feet apart with a mask on your face. And so on we go. Anyway, this next thing, we derive strength from companionship. Strength is derived, and that's seen in verse 12. If one prevail against him, two shall withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. There is strength derived in being united with others. Even Solomon, even the little locusts understand this. If you turn to Proverbs 30, they understand their strength to be derived in being united with others. In Proverbs 30:24, Solomon said, "There be four things which are little upon the earth, but they are exceeding wise." I want you to get that. Not just wise, but exceeding wise. And he says in verse 27, "The locusts have no king, yet they go forth all of them by bands." I mean, what strength does one little locust have? But boy, you put them together in bands and they can leave a field devastated. I mean, they can really be a formidable force. In fact, so formidable can they be that when you read in the book of Joel, you read about this army, this devastating army coming against the nation, leaving them in famine. And you find out as you read that army is an army of locusts. Very interesting how well organized they are as troops in pursuing their objective to destroy the enemy. And so the locusts go forth by bands. They understand their strength in union. And there's fortification that we as believers are supposed to derive from one another. We are supposed to be here to strengthen each other together. Look at 1 Thessalonians 5:11. 1 Thessalonians 5:11. "Wherefore comfort yourselves together." And the word comfort simply means to strengthen or fortify. Comfort. Fort being a root word from the Latin meaning strong, come being a preposition, strengthen with. Comfort. Strengthen with. So together we draw comfort, being with one another. So comfort one another together, yourselves together, and edify. The word edify means to build up and to strengthen, because as you build something up, you make it stronger than when you tear it down. See, so edify, build one another up, strengthen each other, even as also ye do. So there is fortification that believers derive one from another. And this is also seen in Ephesians 4:16, that stresses the importance of every single member doing their part, no matter how insignificant it may appear. Every member being there and doing their part. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 16, "From whom the whole body, fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplieth." You see, when you talk about something being compacted together, you're talking about it being tightly held together, like that. That's what the idea is of being compacted. But it's compacted by that which every joint supplieth. Every member doing his part, contributing his part, is what helps to hold it together. Compacted by that which every joint supplieth, according to the effectual working in the measure of every part, maketh increase of the body unto the edifying, strengthening, building up of itself in love. So as we all are there and we all do our part and contribute our part, we all get fortified and strengthened. And this is an experience, again, that cannot be had in isolation. I mean, think about this for a moment. Again, may I speak to the honor of our late Brother Don Dirkseide. I mean, I don't think anybody would argue with me and to say that Don was not a charismatic personality. I mean, he wasn't real, that wasn't Don. He wasn't a charismatic personality at all. He didn't make a big splash. But you know what? I miss old Don. I sure do. Because he quietly served. He would be the one that would lock the church up every Sunday. He was our lost and found department. For years, he was the one that used to make the cassette recordings of our sermons that fed people worldwide and comforted people. That used to be the way people received our ministry, was through cassette tapes. I remember a man in Australia phoned me one time. He said, "I've been hearing your types." I thought, types? Is he talking about a sermon of the types of the Old Testament? He had me floored there for a minute. But he was telling me he was hearing me types, meaning the tapes. So they even went to Australia. I think they went to South Africa or somewhere in Africa too. So they were going around. But who was recording those every Sunday? Good old Don Dirkseide. You see, the body was compacted, and boy, was it ever, by what just quiet, non-charismatic Don contributed to this body. He is missed. Thank God for having had him part of this ministry. And I appreciate very much Scott Mulder stepping up and doing some of the things that Don used to do for us. And so it follows then that inasmuch as Christians derive strength from being united with other Christians, it follows that this is a vital part of withstanding Satan and maintaining spiritual freedom. We're told in Ephesians 6:10, be strong in the Lord and in the power of His might. And then he goes on and describes putting on the whole armor of God that we may be able to withstand the devil. But the point I'm after in that verse is for you and I to be able to withstand the devil, we need strength. And I've just given you verses that show that that's one thing we derive from fellowship with each other is strength. To help each other in this battle that every single one has with the devil. Matthew Henry, commenting on this passage, says, as in a bundle of rods, they may be different lengths and different strength, but when they're tied together by one bond, they are stronger than any, even than the thickest and strongest was of itself. Take the strongest, thickest rod and bind it with others, and it'll have more strength even than it would have just being by itself. So there's strength in being bound together. And then commenting on this, William Gurnall said, it is no surprise to hear a house has been robbed when it is miles from the nearest neighbor. If you keep your distance from the saints, Satan can more easily sabotage you. But if you walk in fellowship, you have the added protection of their graces surrounding you and ministering to you in times of trial. The apostle, look at Hebrews 10, 23 through 25. I want you to see this point. It's very important. I'm going to read the passage and then I'm going to finish out his comment. In Hebrews 10:23, let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering, for he is faithful that promised. And let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. And so commenting on this verse, Mr. Gurnall said, the apostle harnesses two duties to the same plow: to hold fast the profession of our faith, which takes strength, to hold it fast, and to consider one another to provoke unto love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. So you see, if we're not forsaking being together, if we're provoking one another to love and to good works, encouraging each other in this direction, then this is going to provide for us the strength to hold fast our faith. But if we fail in that, we're going to start letting it go, our faith. But the interesting thing again, just as it was about the better is little, if you have quietness, is this is advice that even secular people in the world recognize is good. You can come to this conclusion under the sun within the framework of this little life without ever looking beyond or considering what God has to say about it. The advantages of companionship are often advanced in business seminars as ways to promote the business and improve one's lot in this world with reference to the next. Some of you have been involved in businesses where you have meetings with others involved in the same business. For what purpose? To strengthen and encourage each other, share your problems, find solutions, and light a fire under each other for what you're endeavoring to do. This is a wisdom that even worldly people can realize. I take you back to this little book on simplicity. Listen to the second paragraph. In the circle of simplicity, Return to the Good Life, author Cecile Andrews helps you discover and create the good life for yourself. And again, this is not written from a biblical Christian perspective, not at all. This is advice that works well in the world. She is renowned for her workshops on voluntary simplicity and her seminars on creating simplicity circles where people explore their own life stories and share information and knowledge, helping one another develop lives of simplicity and satisfaction. The circles not only give people the tools to change, but they also feel unmet needs for community and intimacy and the desire to search for truth in the company of other kindred spirits. Interesting. So this advice he's giving is great for anybody in any context. This is wisdom that even worldly people realize. But, even though there are tremendous advantages to companionship and fellowship, and I want to say this before I pass on. I think one of the most sterling remarks that our brother Greg made the other Sunday when he was speaking to us, he was talking about his rich church fellowship, and he made this admonition. He says, if it is not rich for you, make it rich. I like that. Work on it. Work on it. Because it's true in life. You get out of anything what you put into it. The more you put into the church, the more you get out of it. It's as simple as that. That was excellent advice. It resonated with me, and Sheila was telling me the other day it resonated particularly with her. But the truth of the matter is, at the end of the day, companions can die and companions can fail us. I don't care how faithful anybody is as a friend. There's always going to be that odd time when they're not going to be there for you for whatever reason. Companions can fail us. And the advantages of companionship cannot carry us beyond the grave or bring the ultimate satisfaction, because they with us are subject to vanity. Down here for a few years and gone. And then where are we? Groups come, groups go. I remember one year suffering pretty acute depression. It was the summer after I came back from the Philippines, and one of the things that contributed to my depression is we had a little core group at the gym. We're all kind of in the same age group, and we do exercise classes together. And we just enjoyed doing that together. There was a sense of camaraderie as well as the benefit of the exercise, and the gym shut down. And the class fell apart. And I can remember that contributing to my depression. See, things like that happen. And we read in Psalm 39, 4 and 5, Lord, make me to know mine end, and the measure of my days, that I may know how frail I am. Behold, thou hast made my days as an handbreadth, and mine age is as nothing before thee. Verily, every man at his best state is altogether vanity. So the best of friends are subject to this vain, fleeting life. They will die, they will leave, they will fail. So we need something better than just that advice that helps us get along in this world, but doesn't give us something beyond the sun to hold on to. And lastly, verses 13 through 16, we'll wrap it up on this. We enter now into the vanity of the world of politics. Vanity in the world of politics? Really? Yeah. Big time. I don't know why anybody would want to run for president of the United States. Who would? I would never survive the campaign process. I've made too many inflammatory statements. The media would grind me to powder. Ecclesiastes 4:13 through 16. Better is a poor and a wise child than an old and foolish king who will no more be admonished. For out of prison he cometh to reign, whereas also he that is born in his kingdom becometh poor. I considered all the living which walk under the sun with the second child that shall stand up in his stead. There is no end of all the people, even of all that have been before them. They also that come after shall not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and vexation of the spirit. Solomon finds vanity and vexation even in positions of honor such as kings hold. He talks about a poor and a wise child and an old and foolish king, and he describes this old and foolish king as one that will no more be admonished. Now, that tells us a characteristic of a fool. A fool is a person you can't correct. They will not listen to advice. They just think they've got it all figured out. Proverbs 15:5, that's a fool. Proverbs 15:5, a fool despiseth his father's instruction, And he that regardeth reproof is prudent. Young people go through that when they're growing up. They think they know more than their parents. I'll tell you, one of the surest signs of maturity is when you realize your parents weren't as stupid as you thought they were. They get smarter with each passing year. Have you noticed that? But a fool despiseth his father's instruction. He won't be admonished. But he that regardeth reproof is prudent. And then in Proverbs 17 and verse 10, a reproof entereth into a wise man more than 100 stripes into a fool. So he that rejects admonitions, warnings, reproof is a fool. And this is an old and foolish king. And it does happen that sometimes people are in power too long and they get irrecoverably set in their ways and lose touch with those they govern. You got an example of that right here. Somebody that's just held the reins of power too long, too set in their ways, and lose touch with those they govern. But then he gives another example, not only of an old and foolish king who will not be admonished, but a poor wise child that's better than that kind of guy. And it says he comes out of prison to reign. Now, it's interesting. This is not one of the easier passages in Ecclesiastes to exegete. So I'm just going to give you the best I've got. And if you've got better, I'm here to hear it. But can anybody in here think of somebody that qualifies as a poor wise child who came out of prison to reign? Can anybody think of a Bible character like that? Anybody? Anybody want to shout it out? Joseph was one such. We read the story in Genesis 41. He was in prison. You remember how he interpreted the dreams of the baker and the butler, and they forgot to tell Pharaoh about it, or the one did, the other got killed. And then when Pharaoh dreamed some dreams he couldn't interpret it, he remembered, there was this guy in prison that could do that. So out he comes from prison and interprets the dreams for Pharaoh, and then becomes prime minister of Egypt and rules the entire empire of Egypt. Only in the throne was Pharaoh greater than he. That was a poor wise child that came out of prison to reign. Or what about Daniel? Daniel was a captive. The Babylonians had taken over his nation and had taken him captive. He was a prisoner of the Babylonian Empire, and yet he too could interpret dreams, and the king honored him by making him ruler over the whole province of Babylon. Daniel 2:48, another example. You realize some of the U.S. presidents were born in obscurity and poverty, and yet came to wield the reins of power in this country. Indeed, this agrees with the words of 1 Samuel 2:8 that says, he raiseth up the poor out of the dust, and lifteth up the beggar from the dunghill, to set them among princes. But then going back to one of royal descent, it says, he that is born in his kingdom becometh poor. Sometimes there have been those who've had royal descent, born in a kingdom that later became poor. And it is a fact that many once great wealthy leaders have been removed from power and reduced to poverty. Do you realize that Thomas Jefferson, the great Thomas Jefferson, when he died, left no inheritance? Ulysses S. Grant, when he died broke. He even had to declare bankruptcy at one point. And William Henry Harrison died virtually penniless. And you've got 3 examples in the Bible. I'm not going to read them for you in the interest of time, but in 2 Kings 23:31 through 34, Jehoaz was taken captive and went from a throne to imprisonment. 2 Kings 24:10 through 15, Jehoiakim taken from his throne, taken captive. And then Zedekiah, chapter 25 of 2 Kings, verses 4 through 7, taken from his throne and led away in chains. See, he that is born in his kingdom becometh poor. These were men that were born in their kingdom. They were born to reign, and reign they did, only to then end up in the miserable poverty of captivity and imprisonment. It happens. And then Solomon takes a larger view of all the people. There's no end of all the people. And he considered all the living that walk under the sun, and the second child that shall stand up in his stead. And this second child refers to the next in line to the throne. So think of a king on his throne. The second child would be the one standing in line to inherit the throne when he has it no more. And so notice what happens. The king at some point fell out of favor with the people. The second child stands up. I mean, he's the new promising leader. They're all excited about the new blood that's come to power. But he teaches that those that come after shall not rejoice in him. That is, in that second child that assumes the reins of power. In other words, just as his father fell out of favor with the people, then he too, when he has his turn to be popular and desired and acclaimed, will also eventually fall out of favor. And the people will not rejoice in him any more than they rejoiced in his father after a while. And so what this passage demonstrates is how fickle majority opinion can be when it comes to those in power. In other words, polls and approval ratings are very, very inconstant things. That's what that passage, from what I can understand, that's what that's telling us. And then this is vanity and vexation of the spirit. The old man achieves power, he ends up dying in poverty and out of favor. And then here comes the second to stand up in his stead. And it's going to be the same story as it's been throughout history with all the people that have been before and all that will come after. They won't rejoice in him either. It's only a matter of time, and he will go down in the opinion polls as well, just like his father. So I guess the point there is, don't always be so excited by the new guy in power. And Solomon, in his great wisdom and knowledge, knew enough of the history of kings, because remember, all the kings of the earth came to see him, to inquire of him. 2 Chronicles 9:23. So he had knowledge enough of the history of the kings of the earth to make these observations. That even in the seats of great power, right on the throne itself, we do not escape vanity and vexation of the spirit in this world. Oh, for the quiet life of just serving God peacefully and wherever our little corner of the creation happens to be. May God bless this teaching and forgive any error. Thank you.